Well, this morning it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Adrienne Slack. Ms. Slack is Vice President and Regional Executive at the New Orleans branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In New Orleans, she leads their board of directors, community outreach and development activities. She oversees its economic and financial education programs, and of course, and what we're interested in hearing a lot about this morning, she provides regional input to the Atlanta's Fed Monetary Policy Board. Ms. Slack joined the Federal Reserve System at the Dallas Fed in 1990 and transferred to New Orleans in 1993, where she has served in several leadership positions. She was raised in Mississippi, received her bachelor's degree from the University of Southern Mississippi, and in 2006, New Orleans City Business honored Adrienne as Woman of the Year. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Adrienne Slack.
Well, good morning. It is my pleasure and honor to be with you this morning here on a rainy day. That probably helps me out so the beaches aren't calling you. We've gotten you up really early in the morning to talk about monetary policy. But really what we're here to talk about is the contribution that all of your businesses make to the economy and how we as the Federal Reserve are here to support that contribution. We are here to not only support it, but ensure we have our finger on the pulse of what challenges you are facing, what things that are enabling you to grow, and all of that to ensure that our policy at the national level is supportive of the foundations that allow an economy to grow. So, my introduction talked about a board of directors and some financial education, and what does all of that have to do with monetary policy? We are a very unique organization. So what I have to say today, hopefully, will surprise you a little bit about why somebody from New Orleans is here. So I'll start with, first, everything that you're going to hear from me today is my opinion and my opinion alone. It is not the opinion of the Federal Reserve Bank system, nor is it the opinion of the Federal Open Market Committee. There's one question I'm sure everyone has on their mind this morning, and that's what's happening with interest rates. The FOMC really didn't tell us a lot last Tuesday after they finished meeting. So I do have a slide at the end of the presentation. It's there for a reason because you have to stay till the end to see the real secret. The title was Cracking the Code, so we're going to tell you how we're going to crack the code and let you in on a little internal secret at the end. So the slide here on the screen, so you don't have to focus too much on all those little words, really describes the process that I talked about at the beginning. And that is why we're here today, why myself and Gail Silos, my colleague, are here today, is to support that Federal Open Market Committee. Our president, Dennis Lockhart, sits on that committee with Chair Janet Yellen. He is a voting member this year, which means that hopefully at some point in his tenure, we'll move the interest rate. However, we're a very data-dependent organization. So just because things look like that may happen today, things can change tomorrow that would change that entire scenario. So how do we support him, and what does everybody in this room have to do with that? Well, we've got two teams of people. We have a team of economists on one side of the slide, and we have a team of regional executives on the other side of the slide. The economists focus on the numbers that are coming in data that's released from the government and many other organizations. They put that into their models, they do a lot of forecasting, they study why things are happening, and they provide a lot of information and support to Dennis through their skill, through their science of economics. And then we have the regional executives. The regional executives, as was mentioned, are responsible for a board of directors. I'm also responsible for an energy advisory council that has representatives from across the entire Southeast at the CEO and CFO level that get to speak directly with our president. All of that, in addition to my travels across a zone that I call the Gulf South. It is southern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, Mobile and Baldwin counties of Alabama, through Apalachicola in Florida. It actually takes 3 regional executives to cover your state. There's quite a lot of economic activity that happens in a very diverse manner across the state of Florida. So prior to the FOMC meeting, we all traveled to Atlanta for an entire week, where we visit with Dennis and the team of economists and one another to talk about what it is we've learned. What have we learned in our one-on-one meetings with executives, the roundtables that we hold, the speeches that we give, the questions that we've received, the events that we attend to engage with different industries across our zone to learn about what's happening on the ground. What are you truly seeing in real time? We then compare that to what the numbers are saying. I mentioned we're very data dependent, so what is that data telling us? If what's happening on the ground is different from the data, that means something. We need to figure out why that is. Data can be lagged, so it might just be that you all are aware of what is to come. Or it could be that the data and the anecdotal information all line up exactly. And that tells us something too. It tells us that we can really pay attention to what those numbers are saying. That is all important because we have a dual mandate, and I hinted at that earlier in my opening statement, and that dual mandate is essentially financial stability and full employment. So how do we accomplish that? We accomplish that through our monetary policy tools, which we'll talk about a little bit today. But more importantly, I'm going to walk you through what it is that we monitor that leads us to decision making about those tools. What we monitor are things that you all have access to, the same data that we look at, you all can see. So this will give you a little bit of a picture of what we're monitoring and why as we think about making those decisions. So before we go there, I'm going to start with our balance sheet. We're just going to get this out of the way. So as you know, with the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve engaged a lot of tools that were uncharacteristic. We're in new territory. There are tools that didn't necessarily exist prior to the financial crisis. We pretty much used our interest rate tool to either tighten or expand the money supply. With the depth of the crisis, we engaged in quantitative easing. Quantitative easing, around 2013, there were a number of those programs. But around 2013 really is where it started to significantly increase our balance sheet. It sits at about $4.5 trillion today. And that is something that we will also monitor, ensure that we manage in a very calculated manner as we progress through monetary policy normalization. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a technical explanation. I do it at the beginning of the presentation, so you're not asleep yet. But a technical explanation of what quantitative easing is and how it works. There you go. That's what we do. We push money out into the economy. So after we've pushed the money out into the economy, this is a recap of basically the statement in June last week that the Federal Open Market Committee said. They looked at what's happening in the economy. Again, what I'm going to walk you through that we monitor. In first quarter, gross domestic product did not grow. It actually contracted. For some reasons that were beyond weather, some transitional in nature, some transitory in nature, but enough that we wanted to ensure that the economy really is still moving in the direction that we needed to engage in that normalization process. So you combine that with what's happening in the labor market. The labor market is still strong. There were some weaker numbers, again, in the first quarter, but those have been followed with stronger numbers. And then inflation is the third thing that we monitor, or really pricing pressure is another way to say that. And we're going to walk through those 3 areas this morning. So here's the gross domestic product that I talked about. The contraction in the first quarter that was very significantly impacted by the drop in the price of oil. It was impacted by a lack of pricing pressure, also that had to do with the drop in the price of oil. The consumer's behaving a little differently than we would anticipate the consumer to behave. Weather and the West Coast ports also were at play in first quarter. So I'm going to brag a little bit on our economists, this group of people that study numbers. So we have some economists back at the Atlanta Fed that try to project what GDP is going to come in at. In first quarter, the economist responsible for this nailed the number. He was the only forecasting house in the country that nailed the number. They are now known in the press as the hottest economic team in the country. So I have to brag on them a little bit about that because I don't know of any other point in time where those words have been strung together with the words economic research team. So what's on the slide today, though, is where their model and what it's projecting today. And this is a model that builds over time. You can go look at it online. It's called GDP Now. So as data is released throughout the quarter, it builds and takes that into account. So the time to really look for what second quarter is going to come in at is closer to when those numbers are going to be released. There we go. So I mentioned the price of oil had a big impact on gross domestic product. Why is that important? Well, it's important for a couple of reasons. The price of oil, when that dropped, it dropped the amount of investment headed into this economy. Business structures is where that is calculated in gross domestic product. And so that contracted, that did not feed into GDP, and it was a significant impact. And you can see that represented here in the numbers with rig counts, with industrial production, or the two places at the bottom of this chart I'd point you to really see the significance of what not only the price of oil that we all benefited from at the pump, but that wasn't necessarily a benefit to businesses in the country. The consumer is the other piece of this equation. So there were a lot of theories when the price of oil dropped that the consumer was really going to start spending. The consumer is going to have a little extra money in their pocket. Not only are they going to spend it on something different than gasoline, but maybe they'll add a little more to that because wages were improving a bit. Well, that didn't happen at all, and it's evident also in this chart. If you look at the bottom of the personal savings rate, the consumer didn't spend, the consumer saved it. As I travel around the zone, I actually heard this yesterday in some of my conversations, savings rates are up. Paying down debt is still something the consumer is actively engaged in. With that said, consumer spending, those numbers came out today also, and it is up a little bit. So we're encouraged that we're at least headed in the right direction. Again, the monitoring of that data and the consumer is also a significant portion of GDP, so that's something the FOMC is very interested in monitoring as a piece of the pie of what they monitor for the country. The board-weighted exchange value of the dollar, the price of the dollar is strong. That has an impact on international trade. So if you look at the end of this chart on the 2015 side, you can see a drop in exports. And that is attributable to the strong dollar in some sense. However, when I do talk to businesses across the zone, the other thing I hear that is responsible for that drop in exports is global weakness. They do not blame it all necessarily on just the price of the dollar. It was just another factor that really added to something that they saw weakening for a while anyway. Industrial production, I mentioned the impact on that from oil. Also, exports are at play here, but again, you can clearly see that in the downtrend here. Again, another number we'll be watching to ensure that we are not continually headed in a negative direction there. The labor market is another huge piece. So that's just a sampling of what we look at on the growth side. What do we look at on labor? What progress have we made there? Labor has been something that has been very interesting to watch since the financial crisis. There have been a number of cyclical things that go on after every recession, and a number of structural things that have happened that we have done a lot of digging on with employers such as yourself about how you utilize employees, and that has changed. So let's start with the unemployment rate. What's demonstrated on this chart is the participation rate, and then two different unemployment rates. There are actually 6 unemployment rates, and about a year ago in the news, something called U3 and U6, if you pay attention to talking heads, were talked about a lot. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of insight as to why. So U3 is the commonly accepted unemployment rate. It's the one you hear about in the news. It's sitting at around 5.5% right now. But when you add marginally attached workers and part-time and people that work part-time for economic reasons, that means they've answered a survey question that says, I work part-time, but I'd really rather be full-time, but I can't find full-time work. So those two pieces aren't included. When you include those, the unemployment rate's about 10.8%. I'm going to build a chart here. It's called a spider chart. The reason I'm going to build it is because if I showed it to you all at once, you would glass over and I would completely use you. But it's a really neat chart to demonstrate those cyclical and structural things that I talked about. So we've divided about 12 different indicators that we watch. We don't just watch the unemployment rate. We want to know why the unemployment rate is the way it is. We've divided them into 4 categories. There are the 12 items or so. The small circle in the middle is where all of those indicators were performing at the bottom of the recession if you set them all to 0. The large black circle is where they were all performing just before the crisis. So that's set to 100 at that level. And then I'm going to lay on top of here some colored lines that show you the progress they've made from that inner yellow circle. And there they are. So if you look at the blue one, that's where we are today. And you can see we've really recovered, if not performing beyond where we were at the time of 2007 is where that outer circle is. With the exception of those items that I covered earlier. Those items are not performing in the same manner that they were before. We have more people sitting in work part-time for economic reasons and more people that are marginally attached. Some of that has to do with skills, different skill sets that employers need now than they needed prior to the crisis. Some of it has to do with how employers schedule staff and their ability to use them as part-time rather than full-time, and some other reasons that have driven the labor market and employers to behave differently. Normally after a crisis, you see employers, as things get better, put employees into temporary help services. And then once things get even better, they flip them from temporary to full-time. So you saw that recover really quickly, but the other measures that usually follow along with that, the temporary piece followed really quickly. The full-time piece did not. So inflation is the third leg of that stool that I mentioned. Why are we interested in inflation? Well, that is really where our monetary policy tools come into place, is managing that inflation level. The Federal Open Market Committee has had a target of 2% inflation for a number of years now. For the past 2.5 years, it's really been stuck well below that 2% level. It's one of the things they are closely monitoring to ensure that the economy is strengthening and we're moving that inflation target in the correct direction before we make a move to further tighten our policy and not be as accommodative as we are today. So you can see what is impacting inflation or what is not impacting inflation maybe when you break down some of what is in that basket of things that we're looking at. So on this chart, it's got personal consumption expenditure price index. It's essentially a measure of inflation for all of the things that, the prices for all the things you might consume. And then core PCE takes out of that the price of energy and the price of food because it's very volatile. So you can see even with that out, they're relatively close together, but they're both heading in the wrong direction. Then when you take out, I'm sorry, I've got that backwards. So PCE is really very not headed in the right direction because of some of the volatility in oil and food. So then when you pop up and you take those things out, that's the top green line. The third thing that the economists did, and this is new actually, they rolled this out about a month ago, is they took out the things that are being estimated and that the Bureau of Economic Analysis does not have a fixed price for. So these are things that they are assigning a value to. They, for example, include things like a service you might receive from a church or that type of thing that they would put a value on because it's been consumed, but there's not a price that they can affix to it. So when you take that out, That's where you have the gold line that's there. So what they're trying to do there is figure out what is really influencing the downward pressure on pricing beyond the price of oil, beyond some volatility with food. We also ask business leaders, what are you expecting with inflation? And for a number of years, you can see that it's bounced around a little, but it's generally around 2%. So we've been projecting 2%, they've been projecting 2%, and neither of us have been correct. Towards the end of last year, obviously, when the price of oil dropped, so did inflation expectations with businesses. We do a lot of surveying. So the other entity that we survey is our board of directors. And this is 37 to 42 people at any given point in time that tell us what's their outlook. We meet with them once every 6 to 8 weeks prior to those FOMC meetings that I talked about. They bring information to us also that is very real time. So we ask them for their businesses, what do you think the outlook is? It's still very positive. This is a look back over time through about June 2014, and you can see it hasn't changed a whole lot. It does bounce around a little bit in first quarter, as you might expect, as things were contracting a little unexpectedly there, but really very, very generally positive even today. And I will tell you, as I travel across the Gulf South, that is the sense that I am picking up from businesses, even in South Louisiana. Obviously, in energy, there is not the optimism and the exuberance that there was a year ago at this point in time. And there has been contraction, there's been layoffs, there have been mergers, there have been a number of things that have been happening. But those companies are much better positioned, is what they tell me, than they were in the 80s. Their balance sheets look very different. They were much more flexible. They were able to respond to the price drops, and they are continuing also to look forward. Again, I don't want to oversell their optimism. It is not exuberant, but it's also not impacting the area in the way that some might think. So the monetary policy response, this is really just a recap of what the FOMC's response is and what you can expect from them. Really, I've already discussed why they've made the decision that they made last week. We're very data dependent. We want to ensure that the economy is performing the way it needs to. And there are a number of people on this committee. There are even charts out there. You can go look at where all of them fall. They had to come forth with some projections at the last meeting. So you can look at the projections of the entire committee for a lot of the things that I looked at today. Their projections on growth, their projections on inflation, their projections on where they think the unemployment rate will be over the next couple of years. And that's really what this conclusion is all about. So they are looking for that data to tell them when to move. So here's, the other theory that's out there. The Wall Street Journal, I believe, said, Fed, we know you keep saying you're data dependent, but we've noticed something, and it's about the height of your chairman. So, Volcker was, what does it say? He was 6'7", and interest rates were way in the double digits. And then Greenspan comes along, and he's only 5'11", and it just starts dropping. And then we get Bernanke, and he's only 5'8", and it's nothing. So what are we supposed to expect from a chair that is 5 feet tall? Fed, are you ever going to move the interest rates? So the answer to that is yes, we are very data dependent, and she will find a way through her stylist to ensure that that is not a part of our monetary policy equation. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to entertain some. Yes?
Tim Kruger, Merrill Lynch. I never knew Paul Volcker was so tall. But the world is getting smaller, I guess, because of people like Eddie Stone and CenturyLink, right? So when someone like Christine Lagarde says it's too early for the U.S. to raise interest rates, how much weight does it have? Sorry about that. You want me to repeat the whole thing? I talked loud. How much weight does Christine Lagarde's recent comments from the IMF have on you raising or not raising interest rates? Thank you.
So, as the United States of America, America's central bank, We, in that dual mandate I showed earlier, we are required by law to ensure financial stability for this country and full employment. So our policy is focused on what is the best thing to do for the United States. We have teams of people that I described that are studying the numbers, understanding the linkages between those numbers and our economy and what those drivers are. As that relates to monetary policy, that's really what we look at. So we do pay attention to things like global weakness that I mentioned. We do pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world for the purpose of how does that impact us? And what does that mean for us, and what impact is it having on our businesses? So our policy, though, is very much centered on what we feel needs to happen for the United States. So we have people that are looking at those same indicators that were mentioned in that report, but we'll be making our own decisions about what that means for this country, and those decisions will be made about what's the best decision for the United States. Yeah.
How much is the economy affected by the fracking that's going on, especially in the Midwest? That seems to have really turned our energy situation around, and definitely has helped unemployment up there.
It definitely has, and it gets into some of the comments that I made about what I see in South Louisiana. So that drop in gross domestic product, or GDP, in the first quarter was heavily impacted by that drop in not just fracking, but other oil-related activities as a whole across the country. So that Midwestern piece that you're talking about, the East Coast was very impacted. The South and Southwest were very impacted, anywhere that fracking was going on, because what it's done is, and I'm sure you've seen this in the news, but at this dollar level to produce a barrel of oil, there are a lot more places you can pull that oil from. At this dollar level, the more expensive it is to pull it out of the ground, the less places that it becomes advantageous to pull it out of the ground. So we've had a lot of layoffs, a lot of laydown of rigs, a lot of boats that are stacked across South Louisiana that are not working anymore. And so that's really where the impact comes in for GDP, and something we're watching. So from a labor perspective, it's important that those individuals that are laid off are able to go out and find jobs and still have that income to support themselves and spend. We are finding a lot of that happening in South Louisiana. While there have been a lot of layoffs, our unemployment rate has gone up. It has not gone through the roof. It's gone up by about 2% in the state of Louisiana. I'm not familiar with the state-by-state unemployment rate changes in other places, but generally that's what's happening there. From an economy perspective, there was a palpable impact. That business structures piece is where it's captured, because an oil well, it turns out, is considered a business structure. So for every oil well that wasn't started, and they were starting at a very fast rate prior to that, and it was pushing GDP up, that had a downward pressure on GDP. What we're seeing, though, when you look at second quarter GDP, we're looking at a negative 2% for first quarter, and second quarter is now being projected at 2.1%. So we're headed back to that 2.5%, 3% that one of the slides indicated that our bank is projecting for 2015. So the economy seems to be absorbing some of that impact. Yes?
Staying with oil, is there a number that might be considered an average that would be good for most of the country? Because we hear 75, 80, whatever, but is there some number that you guys are looking at?
Well, so we go to the experts to tell us what they think that market is going to settle out at. So we haven't pegged a number that would be a good number. It's really a number that needs to be driven by the markets and what the market will bear. So the experts tell us, and this is from people that I talk to across the Southeast, it's from experts that we engage with. in some energy conferences we have attended, because we're very interested in what that question is, because it helps us understand what that business structure number that I talked about look at what sort of capital investment is going to be happening. What they tell us is around 70, 75 that you talked about is where people think it's going to settle. I will tell you that's the number people have. When you get into why is it going to settle at that number, it's a lot less clear about why. So I wouldn't do anything with that number. Yes?
I love the chart with the child throwing the money out the window. That's fantastic. As a matter of fact, if you can explain in a simplistic fashion, Wells, you're in uncharted territory with the size of the balance sheet. How do you go about unwinding that?
So that's something we call normalization. And we also have spent a lot of time really studying how we go about that. Because as you said, it's uncharted territory. Getting there was uncharted. Moving us back to something that looks like prior to pre-crisis has been a question. So there are any number of papers you can go out and read on our website that talk about, is the new size of the balance sheet where it should be? Does it need to be back where it was before? Is it something in between? So our focus at the moment is really ensuring that we manage that balance sheet and we manage that normalization. So we don't want inflation to take off too quickly. That would not be a good thing for our balance sheet. So the first thing that you will see is a change in the way that the interest rate looks when the time is right. The other thing that we have to think about is what makes up that $4.5 trillion. So today, that's actually also a monetary policy tool, and it's a very accommodative one. Today, when those items mature on our balance sheet, we're reinvesting. So that's why on the chart, it sits at that $4.5 trillion, and you don't see it headed back down the other direction, because again, it's a tool we have to ensure we're still providing a very accommodative monetary policy. As the economy strengthens, we have the option to start letting some of that roll off as they mature, so we'll stop reinvesting those mechanisms. We also have interest on reserves that we pay banks, and an overnight repurchase mechanism that we will also utilize, because the financial world is not just made up of depository institutions proper today. There are any number of other financial services mechanisms that people use. Money market mutual funds, for example, are a place that is very active, that we also need to ensure that we are controlling the move on that interest rate side and that balance sheet side in a manner that is effective. And those are the tools that we'll use to ensure that the policy the FOMC enacts is effective as we move forward. And I think what you're going to see from us is something that is not going to be necessarily dramatic in nature, given the characteristics that are in the economy today. In their policy statements, they have said, we're going to approach it in this very thoughtful manner. And it's not, you can't assume just because we move that the next meeting, this is what you're going to see. We are, again, going to be looking at all those factors to ensure that the next movement and the next movement are really something that support the economy and do the job that we're asked to do.
With the weakness in the global economy, and you have things like Greece hanging out there, and we have such a big balance sheet, like he was mentioning, is there a fear that we've used all our weapons, and what is the risk if the global economy does continue to weaken, and can we keep going with quantitative easing?
So quantitative easing in the form that we used it, that didn't exist prior to the financial crisis. So is it a tool today that we can use? Yes. So if the data was telling the committee something different today, and if you've looked at some of their policy statements over the past year and a half, what those statements say is we will use that tool as appropriate to what the data are telling us. So yes, it's something we could go back and use again. There isn't anything in the data that I've shown you today that is leading them, or their if you look at their policy statement, it doesn't give an indicator that we're headed in a direction to use that tool in the manner that you're talking about. Is it an option though? Sure, it's an option. And the global weakness, again, I'll just mention that our policy is enacted to support this economy. And yes, it's a global economy, and part of what's impacting us right now is what's happening with exports. So again, it's one factor in many that we study and look at to figure out what our policy needs to be to support what happens here. We're not going to enact a policy to react to something else that's happening globally.
So a lot of the talk's been about balance sheet, winding it down, interest rates, but is there anything that maybe Fox News pundits aren't talking about, i.e. reverse repos, things like that, that you see that just isn't being talked about in the news?
So I will stay away from, I will tell you what the news people are talking about or aren't talking about. I do, as you might guess, watch a fair amount of business news. If you look at the things that we monitor, is we run up to that FOMC cycle every 6 to 8 weeks. The talk builds about what is that Federal Open Market Committee going to do. And pretty much, as I stated earlier, you all in this room, we at the Fed, and all of those individuals at the news agencies are looking at all of the same data. There are any number of opinions and theories about what the data means, why it is moving in the direction that it's moving, and what it is that the Fed may do about that. So when I think about, okay, what is the news focused on? I really look at that to figure out maybe what questions am I going to get from an audience like this, and how do we as the Fed help explain how we look at a measure. The best example of that would be the U3, U6 that I talked about, because prior to a couple of years ago, nobody really thought about the fact, other than the Fed maybe, that there were 6 different unemployment rates. But there was a reason to be thinking about it, and that wasn't wrong to think about it. We were thinking about it. We were looking at all of those measures very closely. So, I can't speak to what every news organization may or may not be talking about, but what I can tell you is that the items that I covered here today really are what we are looking at. And there are, a number of other measures that obviously go into growth. I just put up a sampling of them here today. But if you look at the basket of financial statistics that are released, that's what we're monitoring, and that's what we feel is important. And you can see that reflected in our policy statements. You can see that reflected in some of the information that we have online about what we're thinking about. I would point you to a mechanism or an online article that's produced actually by our research director. It's called Macroblog. And it gets at, I think, some of what you're asking. What are the things that maybe we need to be thinking about that people aren't thinking about today that are maybe hiding there? So he does a couple of things with that blog. He talks about some of the things that are being talked about and tries to present that from what we're seeing with that data. And then the second thing that's done also with that blog quite often is we give you some insight into things that may not be talked about in the press. So why is this particular thing happening with labor, and why aren't wages going up, and why is productivity not performing in the manner that we think it should be? All of those things, again, have been in the news, but Macroblog provides a little bit of insight as to some theories about why they may not be performing, and gets into some of what you may not see on the news regularly, or are seeing that we're helping explain. Yes?
The labor improvement, is it quite,
You reviewed the labor improvements that we've seen, but it's not quite what I'd imagine you were hoping for or what the macro economy is hoping for. What tools beyond what we've currently employed do you think the Fed has at their disposal to try to improve that piece of the pie?
So I'll start with, is it what we were hoping for? Actually, unemployment moved in the direction we were hoping for a lot faster than we ever thought it would. Didn't follow along with that is where it improved and some of the places that I showed you that it has not improved with those part-time for economic reasons and marginally attached workers. The Fed's tools are monetary policy. That's our tool. We have a number of different mechanisms to push that interest rate one way or the other. Communication is another tool that we utilize. But really, some of those structural things are market-driven things that employers are responding to. When I travel across this zone in particular, there is an incredible amount of workforce development going on at the technical and community college level. In the four-year college space, there's a lot of move towards technology and computer science, again, to try to move, and it's a market-driven thing, to try to move people into those skills that are needed in mass today. But our tools are very much monetary policy, so our intent was we're going to provide a very accommodative environment so employers can expand, so employers can hire, and the economy can support that. You need the economy to grow for you to need more employees. But also what businesses tell me is, if you can provide me a piece of software and I don't have to hire somebody, I'm all about that. So, you know, that is something that the market is going to have to adjust to, that isn't necessarily a direct interest rate push on that. And, you know, beyond what I mentioned about the labor piece directly, there are a couple of things that odd kind of labor market have also not followed along. So productivity has not gone up in the manner that you would expect with an unemployment rate as low as it is. That just means that the gains that we are getting are because we're hiring a whole lot of people. The other thing that is not moving in the direction that you would expect with the tightness we're beginning to see in the labor market is average hourly wage. So wages have not pushed up traditionally how they do when you have a labor market that's approaching the tightness that we are. And again, measures that we are very closely watching and talking about in that macro blog that I mentioned to try to get at why is that and what's causing it, so what can we expect going forward in the future in the way of that. All right, thank you.
Adrienne, thank you so much. That was extremely informative, and I think we can all agree that we're very blessed to have somebody as bright and talented helping shepherd our nation's monetary policy. So thank you for your service and what you do for our country. Folks, before we adjourn, and we are ahead of schedule, so how about that on a Friday? Yeah, so before we adjourn, obviously there are some folks that we would like to thank that deserve some gratitude. Certainly the Eglin Air Force Base Honor Guard, again, great to see them with us today. Cox Communications is taping today's event, so if you'd like to view it later, if you feel like you might have missed something or you have a friend that you want to share it with, it will be on YouTube on the EDC's website, so we encourage you to visit that. Marcia Wright Reynolds and Gulf Reflection Studio, thank you for what you do and making sure that we have some very nice photos of these events. And Dr. Handy, you and your team have done yeoman's work hosting us today, and I think we can all agree this venue is wonderful, and it's a pleasure to be here at Northwest Florida State College today. Certainly my staff, our team at the EDC, Kay, Caroline, and Cameron, our University of West Florida intern, thank you for everything you do to make these events a success. And by the way, Susan Shaw, Ron's already mentioned, but anything that you've seen good that has come out of the EDC in the last couple of years, Susan has had her fingerprints on. She has developed the nice displays that you see here, our annual report that our members received this year. our new marketing efforts, our campaign that many of you participated in as champions or joined as a result of. So truly, Susan, we owe you a debt of gratitude. We thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you in September at our next roundtable. Stay tuned, more to come. Thank you so much.